Texas winters are usually mild, but every so often a freak storm rolls in, bringing snow and freezing temperatures that catch everyone off guard. This year, the storm came early, dumping over a foot of snow in a single night. It was the kind of weather that shuts everything down in a state like Texas, where snowplows are scarce and people treat snowflakes like harbingers of chaos. I live just outside Amarillo, in a small house on the edge of a sprawling field. The isolation was usually a comfort, but that night, with the wind howling and snow piling against the windows, the solitude felt oppressive. I was nursing a cup of coffee, bundled in a thick sweater, half watching a rerun of a home improvement show when I noticed headlights cutting through the darkness. It didn't make sense. My house was at the end of a long dirt road, and with the storm raging, it seemed impossible for anyone to be out there. Moving to the window, I peeked through the curtains. A truck was stuck at the end of my driveway, its tires spinning helplessly in the snow. A man climbed out, his movements slow and unsteady as he tried to push the vehicle free. I hesitated. The idea of inviting a stranger into my home made my stomach churn, but guilt crept in as I watched him struggle. It was freezing out there, and leaving him wasn't an option. I grabbed my coat and boots, stepping out into the cold. The wind hit like a slap, stealing my breath as I trudged toward the truck. "You're not going to get it out tonight," I called over the storm. "The road's too slick." He paused, glancing at me, his face obscured by a scarf and hood. After a moment, he nodded. "You can wait it out at my place," I added, motioning toward the house. He hesitated, but eventually followed, his shoulders hunched against the wind. Inside, the warmth hit us like a wave. He removed his coat and scarf, revealing a man in his late 20s or early 30s with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He introduced himself as Ben, offering a brief handshake before I directed him to the guest room. While he showered, I busied myself in the kitchen, reheating leftover chili. When he returned, dressed in the same clothes but more relaxed, I handed him a bowl. He ate in silence, his eyes darting occasionally toward the windows. "Driving to Oklahoma City," he said when I asked what he was doing out in the storm. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, the wind rattling the glass. After he finished his meal, he leaned back in his chair, staring out at the storm. "Think it'll let up by morning?" he asked. I shrugged. "Hard to say. Might take a day or two for the roads to clear." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Guess I'll be here for a while." There was an edge to his tone that set me on edge. I forced a smile, brushing it off as stress from the storm. But as the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that inviting him in might have been a mistake. The hours passed slowly, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Snow piled higher against the windows, muffling every sound except for the relentless howl of the wind. I tried to focus on the TV, flipping through channels to distract myself, but the unease I felt around Ben lingered. He sat in the armchair by the fireplace, staring into the flames, his expression distant. He'd hardly said a word since finishing his meal, and the silence felt heavier than the storm outside. I reminded myself that the situation was unusual for both of us. Two strangers trapped together by forces out of our control. Still, something about him kept my guard up. "How long have you lived out here?" Ben asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. His voice was calm, but his question felt oddly pointed, like he was assessing me. "A couple of years," I said, glancing at him. "Moved out here for the peace and quiet. City life wasn't for me." He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "It's definitely quiet. Almost too quiet." The comment unsettled me. I got up, pretending to check the lock on the front door, though it hadn't been touched since I let him in. Well, it's not for everyone, I said, trying to keep my tone light. I glanced outside. The storm was as fierce as ever, the snow swirling in chaotic flurries. There wasn't a chance he could leave any time soon, not with the roads buried and visibility down to nothing. I'd have to deal with his presence until morning at least. When I turned back, I found Ben watching me. He didn't look away, his gaze steady, almost studying me. I felt my stomach tighten. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to mask my discomfort. "Yeah," he said, leaning back in the chair. "Just thinking." "About what?" I regretted the question as soon as it left my mouth. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "How easy it is for things to go wrong. One bad decision, one mistake, and everything changes." The words hung in the air, their weight palpable. I forced a chuckle, though it felt hollow. "I guess that's true," I said, sitting back down. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. "Guest room's ready whenever you are," I said, standing and stretching. "Bathroom's down the hall if you need it." Ben nodded but didn't move from his spot by the fire. "Thanks. I'll head there in a bit." I hesitated, then turned and walked to my bedroom, closing the door behind me. The lock clicked under my fingers, a sound that felt more reassuring than it should have. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Ben was just a tired traveler with nowhere else to go. But my gut told me a different story. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every whistle of the wind felt amplified in the dark. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind cycling through worst-case scenarios. Just as I was finally drifting off, a soft noise snapped me awake. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway. I held my breath, the seconds stretching into an eternity. Then they stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The house was silent again, but the sense of unease didn't fade. After a few minutes, I mustered the courage to get up. Grabbing the heavy flashlight I kept by the bed, I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. Slowly, I turned the lock and cracked the door open, peering into the hallway. It was empty, the faint glow from the dying fire casting long shadows on the walls. I stepped out, my pulse racing, and checked the guest room. The door was open, the bed untouched. Ben wasn't there. I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind racing. The fire in the living room had burned down to a faint orange glow, casting flickering shadows. Ben wasn't in the guest room, and the thought of where he could be and what he could be doing sent a chill down my spine. I checked the front door. Locked. The windows in the living room were fogged from the cold, but they seemed undisturbed. My boots creaked against the floorboards as I moved cautiously, trying not to make a sound. If he was still inside the house, I didn't want to alert him. The kitchen and laundry room were empty. I gripped the heavy flashlight tighter, the weight of it oddly comforting. A quick glance out the back window revealed swirling snow and darkness. The storm was still raging, burying everything in its path. The only place left to check was the small basement. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step echoing faintly. The basement was cold and damp, the air heavy. I flicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Storage shelves lined the walls, cluttered with boxes and tools. The furnace hummed steadily in the corner, filling the silence with a low drone. I scanned the room carefully. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease in my chest wouldn't subside. Then, I noticed a faint scuff mark on the concrete floor near the shelves. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy across the floor. My flashlight followed the mark, leading to a stack of boxes in the corner. Behind the boxes, I saw it. a small hatch I'd completely forgotten about. It wasn't a proper door, more like an access point to the crawl space beneath the house. The hatch was slightly ajar, a gap wide enough for someone to slip through. I knelt down, peering into the crawl space. The flashlight illuminated a narrow, dirt-floored passage lined with cobwebs. The air smelled of damp earth. There was no sign of movement, but the thought of Ben squeezing into that confined space made my stomach churn. "Ben, if you're down there, you need to come out," I said, my voice steady. Silence. The kind of silence that felt oppressive, heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I waited, then backed away, closing the hatch and pushing the boxes back into place. Whatever Ben was doing, I wasn't going to play into it. I'd deal with him in the morning when the storm had passed and I could call for help. Back upstairs, I double-checked every lock and window, then barricaded my bedroom door with a chair. I climbed into bed, the flashlight clutched in my hand, and stared at the ceiling as the hours dragged by. Every creak of the house, every whistle of the wind felt amplified, and sleep was out of the question. Out. When dawn finally broke, the storm had eased, leaving a thick blanket of snow over everything. The light streaming through the windows should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I stepped into the hallway cautiously, half expecting Ben to appear around the corner. The guest room was still empty, the bed untouched. The house was eerily still as I searched every room again. Ben was gone. No note, no sign of where he'd gone or how he'd left in the middle of a storm. His truck was still stuck at the end of the driveway, half buried in snow. The only footprints leading away from the house were mine from the night before. The hatch in the basement stayed on my mind as I made my way back to the living room. Whatever had happened during the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ben hadn't left the property at all. The storm had passed, but unease lingered like a shadow. From the kitchen, I stared out at the snow-covered fields, Ben's truck still half buried at the driveway's end. The night's events played on a loop in my mind, and the hatch in the basement gnawed at my thoughts. I grabbed a flashlight and crowbar and returned to the basement. The hatch felt more ominous in daylight, its slightly ajar frame daring me to investigate. Using the crowbar, I pried it fully open and directed the flashlight into the crawl space. Tracks marred the dirt floor, leading to another hatch at the far wall. Snow had blown in around its edges, confirming it had been opened during the storm. Peering through, I saw footprints leading away from the house, disappearing into deep snowdrifts. My stomach twisted. If Ben had left on foot, where had he gone and why? I sealed the hatch and returned upstairs, my mind racing. Grabbing my phone, I called the police, explaining the situation. The dispatcher promised to send help once the roads were cleared, but it would take hours. I was left waiting, the house eerily quiet, every creak setting my nerves on edge. By late afternoon, 2 patrol cars struggled up the driveway. The officers listened as I recounted everything, then split up to search. One examined the basement while the other checked the truck. I paced the kitchen, unable to shake the tension that had settled in my chest. "The house is clear," one officer reported, climbing up from the basement. "The tracks lead outside, but the snow makes it impossible to follow." The other officer returned from the truck, holding a small notebook. "Found this on the passenger seat," he said, handing it to me. The notebook was worn, its pages crammed with cramped handwriting. Flipping through it, I found lists of names, dates, and locations. None of it made sense until I reached the back. There, sketched in meticulous detail, was my house. The porch, windows, driveway, even the basement hatch were all marked. My blood ran cold. "Why would he have this?" I asked, my voice shaking. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "We'll investigate and try to make sense of it," one said. "In the meantime, it's best if you don't stay here tonight." Nodding, I packed a bag, my mind racing with questions. Had Ben's arrival been planned? Was the storm just a convenient excuse? As I left, the snow-covered landscape felt suffocating. Somewhere beneath it all lay answers I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. Leaving my house felt like abandoning a piece of myself. I'd built my life there, drawn to the quiet solitude, but now that same isolation had been turned against me. The image of the notebook haunted me. My home, sketched in eerie detail. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the thought. Ben had planned this, but why? I stayed at a motel on the outskirts of town. The room was small, with buzzing fluorescent lights and the faint smell of mildew, but at least it felt safe. The police had promised to follow up, but as the hours dragged on, I heard nothing. Sleep was impossible. I paced the room, checking my phone obsessively, but no calls came. The next morning, I decided to return to the house. It wasn't just curiosity driving me. I needed answers. I'd left in such a rush that I hadn't had time to process everything. The crawl space, the notebook, the truck still sitting in the driveway. It all felt unfinished. The drive back was surreal. The snow-covered landscape was beautiful, the kind of scene that would have once calmed me. But now, it felt like a stark reminder of how alone I was. When I pulled into the driveway, Ben's truck was still there, exactly as I'd left it. A thin layer of frost covered the windows, and snow had drifted around the tires. Inside, the house was silent, untouched. The air was cold, the faint smell of burnt wood from the fireplace lingering. I went straight to the basement. The hatch was still sealed, the boxes I'd pushed in front of it undisturbed. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I opened the hatch again, shining my flashlight into the crawl space. The tracks were still there, leading to the outside exit, but they seemed fainter now, partially obscured by the shifting dirt. I followed the beam to the far end, where the second hatch was slightly ajar. My stomach tightened. Climbing into the crawl space, I moved carefully, every noise amplified in the confined space. The cold, damp air bit at my skin. As I reached the second hatch, I pushed it open wider, exposing the snow outside. The footprints were barely visible now, blurred by the wind, but they led into the trees beyond my property. I hesitated. Following them seemed reckless, but staying in the house felt unbearable. Grabbing my coat and a heavier flashlight, I stepped outside. The snow was deep, slowing my movements, but the trail was just clear enough to follow. It led into the woods, weaving between trees that creaked faintly in the breeze. About 100 yards in, the trail stopped abruptly. There, in the middle of the snow, was a small clearing. At the center was a single object, a tattered backpack. My heart pounded as I approached it. The pack looked old, its fabric worn and frayed. I crouched down, unzipping it slowly, half expecting something to jump out. Inside, I found more notebooks. Each was filled with the same cramped handwriting, detailing what seemed like weeks of observations. There were lists of activities, times, descriptions of my routines. My blood ran cold. He'd been watching me for longer than I'd realized. Beneath the notebooks was something even more chilling. Photographs. Pictures of me, taken from a distance. Some were of me working in the yard, others through my windows. One in particular caught my breath. It was from the night before, a shot of me standing in the kitchen, staring out the window. He'd been close, closer than I'd ever imagined. The sound of a branch snapping behind me sent a jolt of fear through my body. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the trees, but there was nothing there. The woods were silent again, the stillness almost mocking. I grabbed the backpack and bolted back toward the house, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the door, I locked it behind me, leaning against it as I caught my breath. The weight of the backpack seemed heavier now, its contents an undeniable reminder that Ben had planned this for a long time. The police needed to see this. Whatever Ben's intentions had been, they weren't random. He'd chosen me, and I needed to find out why before it was too late. The police arrived within an hour after I called, and by then, I had gone over the contents of the backpack a dozen times. The photographs, the notebooks, the details of my life. It was overwhelming. Each page seemed to confirm what I'd feared. Ben's presence wasn't a coincidence. He'd been planning something, and I had no idea what. 2 officers entered my house, their boots tracking melted snow onto the floor. I handed over the backpack, explaining everything I'd found in the clearing. Their expressions shifted from concern to alarm as they flipped through the notebooks and examined the photos. We'll need to take this into evidence," one of them said. "This is serious. Whoever this Ben is, he's been watching you for a long time. We'll issue a warrant to search his truck and try to identify him fully." The other officer nodded. "You should consider staying somewhere else for now, until we're sure he's not coming back." I agreed, but my resolve to leave wavered. This was my home. I couldn't abandon it forever, even if it no longer felt like the refuge it once was. As the officers loaded the evidence into their cruiser, I stood in the doorway, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. The woods beyond my property felt darker now, like they held secrets I would never uncover. Over the next few days, the investigation continued. The truck turned out to be stolen, registered to a name that didn't match Ben's. Fingerprints in the house and on the notebooks were sent to the lab, but results would take weeks. The waiting was unbearable. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, hoping for an update, dreading the possibility that it could be something worse. One evening, just as I was beginning to think things might settle down, I got a call from the lead investigator. His tone was calm, but carried an edge of urgency. "We've traced Ben's movements before the storm," he said. "It looks like he'd been staying in a motel a few towns over. We've reviewed the security footage and found something disturbing. He wasn't alone. There was another man with him." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Another man?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the investigator replied. "We don't have an ID on him yet, but we believe he's still out there. We're increasing patrols in your area and advising you to remain cautious." After hanging up, the fear I'd managed to keep at bay came flooding back. Ben was gone, but someone else connected to him was still out there, possibly watching, waiting. I double-checked the locks on every door and window, though I knew it wouldn't ease my anxiety. That night, I barely slept. The house felt like a trap, every creak and groan amplifying my paranoia. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I peeked through the curtains, there was nothing but snow and shadows. Morning came, bringing a weak, pale light that did little to chase away the darkness in my mind. The police promised to keep me updated, but days turned into weeks, with no new leads. The second man remained a mystery, and the fear never truly left. Eventually, I packed up and moved. The house, once my sanctuary, had become a place of nightmares. I couldn't stay there, not with the memories of what had happened, and what could have happened hanging over me. Even now, in a new town, in a new home, I find myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the faces of strangers for anyone who might seem familiar. Ben's face is etched in my mind, but it's the shadow of the unknown, the man I never saw, that haunts me most. I'll probably never know what their plan was or why I was their target. But one thing is certain, I'll never again open my door to a stranger, no matter how desperate they seem. If you like these stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click on the bell to listen to new stories from Mr. Fear every day. Also, let us know in the comments what state you are watching this video from. Thank you for watching.